To my explainer tonight. Now, I know over the last week or so, this is a question you have been contemplating. Is Kenya broke? You have heard words like illiquidity. You have heard words like insolvency. Well, let's talk a little bit about this, shall we? Now, before we even get into answering that question, it's important to understand the government's obligations that it is supposed to meet. Now, these are debt, salaries to pay, and in the case of Kenya, transfer to counties, and obviously pending bills. If you owe a supplier, you should pay them. So these are the four main things. Now, development is mandatory, but not necessarily obligatory. I mean, you can say you want to build a road, but, if you don't have the money, what are you going to do? But these others are extremely important. Now, what do they need to do to make sure they pay all of these bills? Collect taxes, which is known as revenue. Now, as to the question as to whether Kenya is broke, there are several levels to being broke. The first definition is the very basic one: when your revenue is not enough to pay for your expenses. Now, in Kenya's case, we have consistently had a budget deficit. Between 2013 and 2022, on average, our expenditure was 40 times greater than our revenue. For example, let's take a look at July to December, when we made or had a revenue of 1.1 trillion shillings with an expenditure of 1.46 trillion. In fact, for the coming financial year, that's 2023 to 2024, Kenya is planning to borrow 700 billion shillings to plug the deficit. Now, in the current financial year that ends in June, we have about 800 billion shillings gap to fill. So therefore, in this definition, Kenya is definitely at this first level because our revenue doesn't match our expenditure. Now, when you're in this situation, you try and borrow to cover the gap. The government will typically borrow with the anticipation that they will get revenue from taxes to pay that back. However, as we know, KRA has not always been successful with meeting targets, right? Now, the next stage of this discussion is insolvency. Now, at this point, revenues are not enough to pay for your expenses. In addition, one is not even able to borrow the difference. Now, this could be because a country is deemed too risky to lend to. International markets say we will lend money to you, but at a higher rate, or we will not lend you at all. Furthermore, the country's reserves would also be too low to pay what it owes. Now, it's the Central Bank of Kenya that manages the country's reserves, which are used to service both external debt and the non-debt government external obligations, and they also serve as a cushion against external crises. Now, Kenya's reserves currently stand at 869 billion shillings. This is to give the country close to 4 months of import cover. Now, it's important to note, though, that this figure of 869 billion is the lowest it has been since the year 2013. That is according to data from the Central Bank of Kenya. But relax. Kenya is not at this stage of insolvency yet, where we cannot pay our debts, cannot borrow, and have depleted our reserves, and we have not defaulted on our debts yet. So no, we are not insolvent. But let's talk about our debt repayment schedule, because that is where our pressure is coming from in this country. This is because the ability to pay your external debt, or the pressure a country faces in doing so, is the real metric for being broke. So how much do we owe, and when is it due? Let's start with this first off. 250 to 260 billion shillings of external debt is maturing this year. This would certainly put some pressure on the foreign exchange reserves at the central bank. And remember, our external debt is in dollars and not Kenya shillings. But, we also have local debts to pay. Remember, the government also borrows from the local market. 900 billion shillings of money that was borrowed locally is also maturing this year. Now, there's a few points to note here as to the confidence of locals to lend to government. It would seem there is reduced confidence to do so. Some are not as willing as they were before to lend long-term to government through the treasury bonds that are 10 to 15 years, but rather the shorter-term treasury bills that mature in 91 days. For example, in February, the government raised only 1/3 of the 50 billion shillings it had targeted in the treasury bond sale. They only raised 16.74 billion. Instead, investors went for the shorter-term treasury bills, which were in fact oversubscribed. Now, with the T-bills, the government was looking for 72 billion shillings. They got bids of 114 billion. Now, this signifies that investors want to get in and out quickly and not wait a long time for their money. This would definitely be something for the government to look into. What other debt do we have? Well, it's this big one that we have been talking about for years now. That is pending bills that are estimated at 481 billion shillings. That is owed as at December 2022. Now remember, this debt goes back years, and attempts and indeed promises even by former President Uhuru Kenyatta himself to settle this money have not been fruitful. But there is some reprieve. The government is expecting about 1.2 billion shillings from IMF in the next month or two, which will fund the debt that is maturing this year. Now, that debt is definitely cheaper, but it is still debt, okay? Now, so how much do we have to pay this year? Well, let's start by understanding our total debt, which is 9.2 trillion shillings. As at January this year. And of this 9.2 trillion, 25.9% of this is maturing this year, which amounts to approximately 2 trillion shillings that we must collect and pay this year. And this, of course, will be gotten from the revenue collections as well as the IMF monies that are coming in. Bearing in mind also that Kenya has other obligations. We have salaries to pay, you've got pending bills, you've got to develop the country, and a percentage that must go to the counties as part of the country's commitment to devolution. In conclusion, therefore, is Kenya broke? Yes, in the sense that our revenues or our earnings are not enough to meet our needs. Is Kenya insolvent? No. We have not defaulted on our external debt payments. Do we have a cash crisis? Yes, obviously, considering salaries for some civil servants has been delayed and we have not paid pending bills for years. Is it a liquidity management issue? Well, that all depends on who you ask. That's my explainer.